Okay, so I've been asked today to talk about populism in the European context and Pegida in this context as well. So populism I should mention that I'm specifying about right-wing populism because the left-wing variety does differ in certain ways, but given that the topic was Pegida. So populism is driven by three main factors usually, so a combination of economic drivers, kind of cultural drivers, which is where the whole immigration debate comes in, and then a sort of protest against the establishment and the elite and the political system. And all three of these things get to the point of the fact that these people feel that they don't have a voice in the system on any of these changes that are happening around them. So the political and the economic and the cultural changes that have happened over the past few decades lead to a certain feeling of uncertainty and anxiety, as Frank said earlier. And populists tend to feed off of this anxiety and try to unite the people who feel this way through a certain rhetoric by saying, we are the people. So Pegida says this, UKIP says this not in a direct way, but it's always about the people, the Volk. That's why quite often populist parties are called the People's Party. And the people, though, tend to be defined in quite an exclusionary way, though. So usually in terms of ethnic or cultural characteristics. So it's not just usually about the numbers, but it's also a sort of qualitative threat that immigration, in this case, seems to pose to people. So populists, through speaking in this sort of way of we are the people, our native culture is being tainted by these others. They tend to stoke the anxiety and foment the fear. So instead of encouraging people to encourage each other's freedom, their freedom of movement, their freedom of religion, or their freedom of expression, it kind of tells people to be suspicious of one another's choices. So immigration tends to be the scapegoat for a lot of populist parties in this sense, that instead of looking at the bigger, much more complex picture of how the economy has changed, that we have low growth with aging populations, rising inequality, the solution to all of these very complex issues is a very simple one, that we just need to close our borders, we need to reduce immigration, or we need to coerce a more forceful integration, and all of these problems will go away. So in this sense that, so it becomes it's a politics of grievance and of anger. When talking about immigrants, populists also tend to differentiate between the real immigrants that deserve to be there and the fake, usually asylum seekers who come for to milk the welfare system or to take advantage of other countries. So, but this tends to be based on myths and deceptions about the numbers. There's been quite a bit of work done, especially by Ipsos Mori, about this, taking a look at cross-national data, and there's a massive gap in terms of the numbers that people think exist of immigrants versus the actual number of immigrants in the countries. That same gap exists when you ask people how many Muslims they think are in the country versus how many are actually there. And the interesting thing is that when people do actually have the real numbers, their views about immigration are much less extreme. But because the narrative that populists put forward are based on these myths and deceptions, it's why people, and quite often people who live in areas where there isn't very much immigration, tend to feel as though their native culture is being tainted, or that there's too much diversity in the country that's reducing social cohesion. So this isn't actually based on lived experiences, but quite often is propagated by populists and furthermore in the media. And this is also why we've seen the success of populist parties in certain countries, like in France and Denmark and Sweden, where when we've had the sort of centrist, usually centre-right party, take a harsher stance on immigration in response to populist parties, the populist parties have actually done better because of it. It reinforces these myths and these perceptions that there is a massive crisis and that our society is being tainted, that when people have a view that 30% of their country is Muslim, when in fact it's 5%, and well, in Pegida's case, in the region where they've started, it's less than 1%. There's a massive disparity between the reality and people's perceptions. And I think that's why Merkel did a really good job in standing up quite strongly to Pegida in her New Year's resolution and said that Islam is a part of Germany. I think that this sort of rhetoric and what she was saying is really the right response on this. Because on the one hand, it's true that we won't win the battle against populists just by forcing facts and stats down people's throats, but at the same time, there needs to be a more factually balanced narrative around immigration by our leaders, especially since we do live in a context in a globalized society where we need immigrants, not just to fill gaps in the labour market, but also to sustain the economy, to pay for our ageing societies, to sustain public services, to pay for pensions and healthcare. We also need this narrative to highlight the fact that we shouldn't be judging people by their nationality or by their religion or language or gender or sexual orientation, but as individuals contributing to the shared society of which they take part of. So although this narrative, changing the narrative around immigration and about our society just starts to tackle the symptoms of populism, I think it's a good place to start and where we should be going. And I like the last line of Chi's piece that she wrote about her experience in Newcastle, that it's a good platform for sharing the values that we want to live by. And I think that having this value-based narrative is really important. And then finally, I just want to say that though tackling the symptoms by changing the narrative around these debates is important, the bigger underlying questions of what's driving populism in the first place are really the issues that need to be tackled. So I think in this one sense, I do agree that populism can be a force for good if it forces the political establishment to kind of reevaluate the status quo and the way things are running, and to reconsider the balance of power between the elected elites and citizens who, to a certain extent, don't feel like their voices are being heard. I mean, party membership has been declining, party identification has been declining, there's been low voter turnout across the board. People aren't engaging to the same extent in traditional politics, and I think that the rise of populists might at least lead to a certain recognition that maybe there also needs to be an addition to democracy of doing things differently to include these other voices that feel like they're not being heard. So part of the research that I'm doing around this at Policy Network now has to do with looking at different democratic innovations, not just in Europe, but in Canada and Australia, in the United States. And I'm just, because of time, I'm going to mention one example that in the Netherlands, the government has recently agreed to fund 10 G1000s, as they've called them. So what this is a group of 1,000 randomly selected citizens in a town to come together and to discuss the issues that matter to them, together with the elected council people who then take those decisions seriously. So there's no kind of set agenda for this ahead of time. People are asked to come into these meetings and they're asked 3 questions. What's important for you to happen in your community for the next 4 years? What do you think has to happen to make that happen? And what are you going to do to help make it happen? So I think to consider looking at these sort of other democratic innovations as a way of thinking about the underlying drivers of populism in terms of the distrust in politics to actually achieve prosperity, to actually represent the people, to have other voices heard, obviously isn't a one-all solution, but I think it's something that could help in the long term if these sort of conventions could be institutionalized, because not only are they more representative, but they bring together what the people call the others, to show them that actually there aren't that many differences between you as you do imagine. And from the examples that I've looked at in all the countries that I mentioned, that tends to be the case. So more research needs to be done around that, but I want to end on that kind of maybe optimistic note.